Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Rusi, sparing your Friday for us, and you think it's tough for you on a Friday. General Townsend, this is the culmination of 2 weeks travel for him, a week in Israel first and then touring the British Army with General Patrick, being taken around guns and all the rest of the really good stuff. And he's going to share some of that stuff with us shortly. But this is the 72nd Kermit Roosevelt lecture, which was not put forward by Kermit Roosevelt himself, but by his wife, who thought that this was a requirement. This was a needed part that Kermit's legacy would provide. And the son of the US president served in both the British Army and the United States Army in both World War I and World War II. He was a guy of significant, obviously, combat experience. And the one thing that he thought is senior leaders of these two countries need to talk. It's not necessarily about the interoperability of a kit, but it's about the interoperability of their minds. And this was something that, his wife nailed, and that Kermit Roosevelt himself didn't. And, lots of people know about Kermit Roosevelt, a great soldier, an explorer, a businessman, one of these great multifaceted individuals, but was deeply affected by his experience in both World War I and World War II, and eventually suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and committed suicide, very sadly. But this is his legacy. This wonderful opportunity for senior officers from the UK to go to the US and obviously back in. And therefore, today we are delighted to welcome General Townsend to us, who is the commander of US TRADOC, Training and Doctrine Command. And in that, his team he sees about 500,000 troops a year running through his command. I mean, that's not a small number, let's face it. That's a pretty significant terms of reference for him. And his background gives him this huge amount of experience to take him there, commanding at every level from company to corps, all the way through. Combat experience from almost the point where he graduated into the US military as a second lieutenant. From 1982 right through to his most recent experiences. I mean, you name it, the operations, he's been there, seen it, and done it. More recently, 4 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and his last in Iraq and Syria from Kuwait, covering the counter-ISIL coalition. I mean, it's this huge span of experience. And now he's got to take that and he's got to mold it and morph it into something that he delivers for the future of the US Army, to deliver in fighting. And this has ended up in multi-domain battle previously, and I think the General will talk about multi-domain operations today, and we'll leave him to talk about that. And this single concept is really useful, but, fights are differentiated. They're different between different times and different theatres. And back in 1944, on June the 15th, the Allies were fighting their way inshore from D-Day. But at the same time, you had a very different type of battle that was happening in the Pacific. And on the 15th of June 1944, the US invaded Saipan, which, as we all know, was a pretty bloody conflict. And these two very different ways of fighting came out such that a single unifying doctrine was simply impossible to deliver. And some of these challenges that the General's now got in TRADOC is making a single concept fit for every sort of fight the US is going to experience. Not easy, most difficult, and I think we've got the man to do it. General, the floor is yours. Can I just remind you first that this part from the podium is on the record. When the General sits down, and I'll remind you again, that will be off the record, which will allow us to have a more expansive conversation. But General, the floor is yours.
I want to say what a special honor it is for me to be here with you today. Some of you may know that I grew up in the southeastern part of the United States in the state called Georgia, named after our former king, of course. The Australians like to say that they are a nation of former British convicts, but I believe it's my home state that has first claim to that title. The Crown formed the colony of Georgia in the early 1700s to serve as a buffer between the king's much more valuable colonies to the north and those shifty Spaniards in Florida to the south. Apologies to any Spaniards in the room. Of course, one only populates a buffer colony with the best and brightest the nation has to offer, We refer to them as convicts, hooligans, and other ruffians. That's my bloodline. It should not surprise then that Georgia became one of the first colonies to revolt against the crown. 80 years later, Georgia would become one of the earliest states to again revolt against its own U.S. government at the start of our Civil War. So the irony of someone who has been educated in the Georgia public school system addressing all of you today does not escape me. Thank you for coming to listen. I think Professor Roberts just mentioned that frequently our two peoples are separated by a common language. I'll show you that the gap is not as wide as you might imagine. So, for example, you have cricket, we have World Series baseball. You have football, we have real football. You have Range Rovers, and we have pickup trucks with giant tires. You have Formula One, and we have NASCAR. You have room temperature bitters, we have ice cold Budweiser. Actually, I've seen Budweiser on tap in a lot of pubs here in London over the last week. But in all seriousness, both of our peoples enjoy a very common set of values and a strong sense of family. So if I'm completely honest with you, I actually have family members that could have been regular extras or doubles in that film. Kidding aside, I do want to share a few thoughts with you today about the importance of our partnership, the special U.S.-UK relationship you've heard about, and where we're headed together as we work to develop a new warfighting concept to address the challenges of future operational environment, future war. If you find it difficult to translate my buffer colony southern drawl into the Queen's English, raise your hand and I'll just speak more loudly. So what's this Kermit Roosevelt lecture series all about? Professor Roberts here just told you a pretty good bit about it. I didn't really have a clue about it until about 4 months ago when I was told I was going to come do this lecture. And I said, what is that? Pretty remarkable story here. This man who served in both British uniform and American uniform in 2 different wars. So in both world wars, you know, there were a number of Americans who came to Europe to join the Allies in the fight long before the U.S. government joined the fray. Kermit Roosevelt was one of these Americans. One of the few that had the distinction of coming to fight twice before our nation did. I think probably I was out running along the river this morning and I ran by the Battle of Britain monument. Remarkable monument. And there were Americans in that battle, the Eagle Squadron, who came before our nation did. And Kermit Roosevelt was one of those who came and joined the British Army. Your army decorated him with the Military Cross. When he died, his widow, Belle, as Professor Roberts indicated, wrote our Chief of Staff, General Marshall. And he proposed this annual exchange. She proposed this annual exchange. And I'll quote from her letter to him. So that the development of a closer relationship between individual English and Americans and a better understanding between the military forces of the United States and the United Kingdom would contribute in large measure to the preservation of world peace. Pretty ambitious, thoughtful, foresightful charter there for us. So we've been doing this now since, I think, about 1947, and I'm really pleased to be here. As I mentioned earlier, our nation's special relationship got off to a somewhat rocky start. We dumped your tea in Boston Harbor, you burned our capital. Somehow that doesn't seem quite a fair trade to me. But on the plus side, there's General Benedict Arnold there in the upper right. You notice he's wearing blue on the left of the Continental Army and the red of the British Army on the right. So he was a general in the Continental Army, and he sold the defense plans for West Point to you Brits. So even before Kermit Roosevelt, we had an officer who managed to serve in both the British and U.S. armies. In his case, at the same time. I am pleased, however, to note some of the finer parts of American culture have made their way and have been ingrained into your culture here. As I walked about London last night after dinner, I noticed McDonald's, Domino's, Burger King, and Five Guys burgers. You have to, Five Guys, that's good burgers right there. They really are. Since the early years of the 20th century, we have enjoyed a special relationship, and that's what we call it, and it is. Built as wartime allies and eventually NATO partners. We both believe that our governments are meant to serve our citizens, that they exist to preserve the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the populace. I had an opportunity while I was here to travel to Salisbury and see the Magna Carta, a document much studied and admired by America's founding fathers. I learned some things about the Magna Carta that I didn't know, but it has been a model for basic individual rights and freedoms, and I think these are the principles that our two nations fight together to preserve. I'm going to show you a quote from Winston Churchill's diary. It reflects his thoughts that though the Japanese attack on the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, while a terrible event for America, was also a source of relief for him as a leader of the British people, because it meant the U.S. was now fully in the war on the side of the Allies and would not settle for anything less than complete victory. It was this shared sacrifice, service, and victory during World War II that has cemented the bonds of our friendship and this special relationship that we speak of. Since the end of our war, our nations have sometimes had our differences, but we have always stood together when it really counted. Each of us here have a role to play in nurturing this relationship in the future. And it takes nurturing. It takes events like this, just one part of the engagement between our two great nations, but it takes work. So why do we need this relationship? The recent movie Darkest Hour provides us a great reminder of the dangers of not keeping an emerging threat in focus and in check. Churchill's unwavering commitment to both confronting and defeating evil, despite the odds, still inspires Britons and Americans alike. It provides a blueprint for us and future generations that we must recognize and act or risk everything we hold dear. My visit to the Holocaust Museum in Israel a week ago was another reminder of the dangers of complacency and the necessity of leadership and action. I would say that the emerging threat or threats of our generation, the coming generation, I'm looking here and I actually see people more about my age than younger. There's a few of the younger lads in the back, lads and lasses in the back. Probably the emerging threat of your generation are a revanchist Russia and a revisionist China. I believe we will find ourselves training and leading our troops to compete with, and if necessary, confront Russia or China or their proxies as they seek to test the current world order in places like Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the South China Sea. The other part of my title my speech today mentions the return of conflict at scale. Any student of world history knows why our mutual work to preserve world peace is so important. Looking back over history, it seems like about every 50 to 70 years or so, we have a major conflict in the world with a lot of loss of life. It's been nearly 75 years now since the last World War, since the horrors of London, Dresden, Stalingrad, Berlin, Hiroshima, and others. Conflict and a destruction on a scale and of an intensity that we military professionals know we must deter, to avoid, if possible, in the future. Can we, through competition, avoid the cyclical bloodletting we have seen throughout history? The potential for conflict with massive loss is there. If we expect to extend this unprecedented period of relative peace, we are going to have to prepare for an operating environment that is growing more lethal and returning to a scale we haven't seen in decades. Now my staff, you probably all know what this is. My staff found this for me last night. I think it's remarkable. We toured the Tower of London last night and observed the ceremony of the keys, and I'd never seen this photograph before. Those are poppies that represent your war dead. They're arrayed around the Tower of London. Remarkable, I think. 880-some thousand of them. For the rest of my presentation, I'll briefly discuss three things about how we can think about warfare, future warfare at scale, and how to do it better. I'm going to talk about multi-domain operations briefly. I'll talk about how we do multi-domain operations today versus in the future, and I'll talk about future of urban warfare. The bottom line is the character of warfare is changing. Someone said that the intellectual leads the physical, so if we want to affect change in the future, we've got to think about it today. So let me turn to multi-domain operations briefly. In the over 25 years since Operation Desert Storm, our adversaries have been studying our battlefield operations and have learned three main lessons, I think. First, don't let NATO allies establish a foothold in the area of operations. Once we establish a foothold, we will be nearly impossible to dislodge, and we will use this base of operations to build a mountain of capability and support. Second, fracture the air-land battle framework. Isolate the air domain from the land domain. Third, don't allow the allies to maneuver to gain a position of advantage. Accordingly, our likely adversaries have invested heavily in anti-access and area denial capabilities such as sophisticated integrated air defenses, long-range precision fires, offensive and defensive electronic warfare, and strong cyber capabilities among them. We can no longer assume that we have dominance in all domains, certainly not everywhere and certainly not all the time. So since the future operating environment has changed, our doctrine must also evolve. So the U.S. Army's answer to these developments was the multi-domain battle concept, now known as multi-domain operations. The multi-domain battle concept was originally designed to accomplish three things. First, get past the enemy's anti-access capability. Second, avoid domain fracturing. And third, preserve our freedom of action. We want to penetrate at a time and place of our choosing in more than one domain by opening windows of domain superiority to allow us to maneuver inside the adversary's anti-access bubble. So assuming that we don't have constant superiority or supremacy in all domains at all times, we're going to have to open up windows of superiority. Today we have stovepipe solutions in all domains that we have to better synchronize and integrate in the future. I think the tempo of future war will not afford us the time to synchronize those solutions as we do it today. Someone mentioned to me earlier today this notion of hypersonic capabilities. We know the Russians and the Chinese are moving out on hypersonics. They may even be ahead of us in that area. So if that's the case, that's going to quicken the tempo of future war. Multi-domain operations strives to rapidly and constantly integrate all domains and give us increased agility and create multiple dilemmas for the enemy. So first of all, why did we change the name from multi-domain battle to multi-domain operations? Quite simply to get broader buy-in for the concept. I mentioned it's an Army concept, but soon it will be a U.S. joint concept. I was asked about this before we came down here and failed to state that it's been developed in partnership with the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Air Force, and the U.S. Navy. It's still in draft. We're going to publish another draft of it this calendar year, with the goal of having a fully joint concept in the next year. So some audiences thought the word battle sounded too tactical. Some thought it sounded too land-centric. And I told you we're looking to get joint buy-in. And actually, I had one actually tell me he thought the word battle was too violent and barbaric. It is a war-fighting concept, I reminded him. But the truth is, the word battle just didn't really comport with the view from our own national defense strategy that nations are in a constant state of competition when not in conflict. So I think this notion that there's peace and war is probably not quite as peaceful as we think it is. We're in a constant state of competition with our adversaries in between conflict. So what does competition mean? Well, first, our national defense strategy says our adversaries are expanding coercion, violating principles of sovereignty, exploiting ambiguity, and deliberately blurring the lines between civilian and military, thus undermining the international order, while undercutting its principles and rules of the road. We can look at some really recent examples you're all familiar with to see those words playing out. Crimea, Ukraine, the Baltic states, South China Seas. In the South China Sea, the Chinese have built islands where none existed before, or they've expanded islands where little atolls were stuck up out of the surface of the sea at low tide. They've created land, they've built bases on that land, and now they're militarizing with anti-access capabilities. Why are they doing that? They're competing. Look at Russia and Crimea and Ukraine. Violating principles of sovereignty, expanding coercion, exploiting ambiguity, blurring the lines between civilian and military. Little green men. Look at Syria. Recently, our U.S. forces there had a bit of a dust-up with a formation we thought initially were a regime. Turns out 200 or 300 Russian mercenaries in formation. They're competing. Our two nations know how to compete short of conflict. We proved it. We outcompeted the Soviet Union over 45 years of the Cold War, and we won. In my opinion, we're not competing as well as we need to today with the likes of Russia and China, and we need to step up our game. We're starting to get our game back, but we have a ways to go. Multi-domain operations is ultimately about how the U.S. Army and the U.S. Joint Force will fight in the future. However, we already do some of this today, but I would say that what we do today is not adequate to meet the demands of future war against near-peer competitors. During my time as a commander of Allied forces fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we brought together air, land, sea, cyber, and space systems to identify, target, and destroy ISIS command and control centers and propaganda centers, media centers. It took us several weeks to put together a multi-domain operation to strike ISIS command posts and propaganda centers, and that operation only lasted a few days. Some of you in this room may have participated in that operation. When I looked at the crowd and asked for a show of hands up at 3rd Division and 1st Division, there were British officers there who raised their hands, who were there in our headquarters and in some of our subordinate units there and participated in this operation I'm talking about. So if you look at the slide there, I'll give you a brief description of the operation. You see the Iraq-Syria border, that's western Iraq and eastern Syria. You see the Euphrates River Valley running through it. The green icons there are our Syrian Democratic Force partners attacking from the north and the northwest. You see Raqqa, the global capital there, had been liberated. And they're advancing down there to an area we call the Middle Euphrates River Valley, or the MERV. The little blue icons that say A3E, those are U.S. and coalition advisory teams. And it wasn't just a U.S. operation, there were coalition partners there. Advise, assist, accompany, enable. That's what A3E is. It basically tells what they do. Those are the most fully capable teams that had few restrictions on their ability to employ all their capabilities and go with their partners to do it. So we're marching down to the MERV, and you can see the 3 locations there that are highlighted or drawn with solid lines. 3 representative ISIS command posts or media centers where they're doing propaganda. Well, we knew where those were. We had good targetable 10-digit grid coordinates for those. we could have just struck them. Problem is, just like us, they have alternate command posts. So the survivors would have picked up and moved to their alternate command post, and thus would have started another several-week cycle of trying to find those things. So instead, one of our subordinate units brought to us an interesting concept, a bunch of special operations folks, really brilliant people. They brought to us this concept that they needed help with. They wanted to deny these primary command posts with non-lethal capabilities, specifically space and cyber domain. And that would cause the enemy to move to their alternate command post, and we would watch him. That would unveil his route of travel. That would unveil maybe some safe houses or resupply nodes along the way, and it would unveil those alternate command posts, some of which we had an idea where they might be, and others we didn't have a clue where they were. So we did this. We put together this operation. The first fires were delivered were ones and zeros, digits, electrons from space and cyber capabilities. And we shut down their primary command posts and media centers. And we watched. Sure enough, the enemy picked up and moved to the alternate command post, and we were able to discover these routes and safe houses along the way. We were able to discover these, confirm that these were in fact their alternate command posts, and we were able to find out some of these over here. So it worked out great. Once we identified their alternate command posts, we started striking the targets in reverse order. The alternates first, then the safe houses, and finally the primary command post. The operation worked pretty well. We didn't have the lasting effects that we wanted because ISIS proved to be quite agile in regenerating their capabilities. But that's a multi-domain operation. Now, I didn't know the term multi-domain when we were doing this. I hadn't heard it yet. But it was a multi-domain operation. But it took us 3 weeks, roughly, to put this together, and it unfolded over a period of only 4 or 5 days. I would call that episodic synchronization. That's probably about the best we can do today is episodic synchronization. When it takes 3 times longer to plan and coordinate the operation than it does for the operation to unfold, that's not a good ratio. I think that will not serve us in a future fight against a near-peer competitor. So let's look at how we'll have to do this in the future. Episodic synchronization falls short of what will be required in future war against a near-peer adversary like Russia or China. Multi-domain operations requires the ability to employ cross-domain capabilities organically. We've got to flip the time paradigm on its head. It's got to take us minutes or days to plan and coordinate an operation that'll last days and weeks. Hard to do that today for a bunch of reasons. Some of these capabilities are not military tools. So it's not like the military can decide, let's go do this. We've got to get the whole of government on board. In fact, some of these tools didn't belong to CJTFO. That was one of my main problems with the previous with that operation we did. I didn't own all the tools. So no problem, I went to my higher headquarters and I asked, well, my boss didn't own all the tools. CENTCOM didn't own all the tools. Turns out the U.S. DOD didn't own all the tools. Turns out the U.S. government didn't own all the tools. In fact, we employed tools from coalition partners to help us do that operation. I couldn't get access to all the U.S. government's capabilities for that operation. In the end, we had enough multinational partners who stepped up to provide capability. There's some good reasons for that. There's this tension between intel loss and gain versus intel loss. There's a tension between I have this exquisite tool and I might need to use it against a near-peer adversary someday. I'm not sure I want to actually potentially compromise it on this operation. As important as this is, it may not be as important enough for me to employ this tool now and risk losing it. So there's some good reasons for that. So in the future, I think what we have to do is rapid and continuous integration. That's my buzz phrase. We need to be able to provide integrated, multi-domain solutions from the start, executed within minutes. Let me turn now to urban operations. I think urban warfare at scale. I think the final aspect of conflict, of future war I want to talk about today is that, urban operations. Despite our druthers otherwise, we know that future war will most likely play out in an urban setting. With increasing likelihood, it will be in a mega city. What's a mega city? Wars are fought, won, or lost where populations exist. The UN estimates by 2030, 2/3 of the world's population will live in large urban areas. Large cities are defined as 5 to 10 million in population, and those currently there are about 45 of those in the world, and the UN estimates there'll be somewhere approaching 90 of those by 2030. The UN estimates megacities, which they define as over 10 million in population, will increase from about 30 today to about 60 by 2030. Megacities are extraordinarily large, hyper-populated, complex in all dimensions, literally unboundable. So Mosul was a large city, about 2 million before ISIS. Large city split by a river. It was difficult to invest or surround, but we were able to do it after a few months of combat. It was possible to do it. A mega city, that's nearly impossible to do. So Mosul doesn't really fit all these definitions, but it gives us some glimpses at what war in a mega city might be like. I'll make a few brief points about that, and then I'll conclude. So first, the point I'll make is a notion called reverberation. More so than in a rural environment or a small city, in a large or mega city, every act reverberates. Maybe we need to come up with a new word because I'm having a hard time saying that today for some reason.
Gotcha.
It reverberates out and back in, sort of like dropping a pebble in a pool of water. You see the ripples go out, they hit the side of the pool, they come back. Someone gave me a better analogy, which is like a rack of billiard balls. You put the rack of billiard balls on the table, you take your cue ball, and you break the rack of balls. Some of us are good enough to figure out where the cue ball will go, and maybe a few of the other balls will go, but I can't keep track of all the balls in the rack, and they go in, for me, unpredictable directions and ways, and they bounce all around. That's probably a better analogy of reverberation. So every act you take, every decision you make, every message you send out in a mega city is going to reverberate, probably in unpredictable ways. Now, I did have a quite bright British officer from 1st Division's Medical Corps instruct me after my speech that a rack of pool balls actually bounces around the pool table in a mathematically predictable way. I gave him the point and said, maybe true for you, but not true for me and most of us, that we can actually define where all the balls will go. Second point I'll make, the scale and scope of destruction and human losses will be magnified in future war in megacities beyond most of our current comprehension. Over the past 16 years of small wars and counterinsurgency, we've grown accustomed to relatively light casualties. From 2001 to today, in 3 hot wars and scores of lesser actions, the U.S. has suffered about 5,000 combat deaths. That number may sound high to us sitting here today, but it's about the number of deaths we suffered on one day, D-Day, in Normandy 74 years ago. My point is, I believe we need to prepare ourselves and our junior leaders and our soldiers for destruction and casualties on a scale that they're unfamiliar with and that we have only read about in history books. This slide compares Mosul and Stalingrad. Now clearly, Mosul is not equal to Stalingrad in terms of force-on-force ratios, historical significance, or casualties. But Mosul and Stalingrad do intersect in ways. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted about 5 months. Now, it was total war then. At the height of the battle, there were roughly 1 million troops on both sides engaged, a few more Russians. The casualties were staggering. Constant strain on the combatants and their commanders. The Nazis' 6th Army commanding general developed a nervous tic on the side of his face from the strain of command in that situation. The Germans called it Rotten Krieg, rat war. War in the cellars, war in the rubble, with no mercy for civilians and few prisoners taken. In some ways, the Battle of Mosul is similar, and I believe a harbinger of things to come. Mosul had an original population of about 2 million. There were only probably 5,000 or 6,000 ISIS fighters in there at their peak. They were attacked by over 90,000 Iraqi security forces and about 1,000 or 2,000 coalition advisors. And you're thinking, why would it lasted 9 months. Why would it take 9 months for 90,000 troops to defeat 5,000 or 6,000? Well, the military folks in the room know that if you want to defend against a superior force, go to a city and dig in. ISIS fought very determined right to the bitter end. Large swaths of the city were damaged. Some parts on the west side, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. It was medieval and brutal combat. And you can see from the photographs there, the similarities there. Stalingrad on the top, west side of Mosul, not far from the Al-Nuri Mosque there on the bottom. And the last week of Mosul looked like something from an Iwo Jima war footage tape. Marines attacking the Japanese on Iwo Jima. There was a small postage stamp. It was about 400 by 400 meters. It shrunk to 200 by 200 meters. It took them 7 days or so to take that final piece. Literally, you could almost throw a rock across it, and it took a week to clear that. The last days, there were collapsed buildings that had fallen down onto the lower floors. Imagine a 4 or 5 story building, and the top 4 floors are rubble, and they're lying on top of the bottom floor, and they make a 20 to 30 foot deep cap of rebar, steel reinforced concrete rubble is the overhead cover on this now perfect fighting position. The first floor and the basement of the building are intact. Our penetrating munitions actually aren't designed to penetrate a target like that. They're designed to penetrate properly formed concrete. And that rubble just seems to absorb munitions, just sort of bounces and absorbs them. So in the end, there was an Iraqi bulldozer. The operator had his iPhone heads pieces in so he could drive his bulldozer and not be disturbed by the gunfire being directed at him. And on either flank was an Iraqi squad protecting the bulldozer as ISIS fighters jumped up with suicide vests and RPGs to try to take out the bulldozer because the bulldozer was the killing effect. The bulldozer advanced across the rubbled landscape, burying ISIS fighters wherever they popped up. If a guy popped up with an RPG, the Iraqis tried to shoot him down before he could get a shot off, and then the bulldozer would just turn and bury rubble over his hole. We found ourselves scrambling around looking for flamethrowers. They would have been extraordinarily useful. The U.S. military doesn't possess any flamethrowers. Haven't found a source. Actually, there are some armies that have them, but I didn't have access to them on a short timeline. Our 2 armies would have done it faster. We would have done it with fewer casualties, and we would have done it with less destruction. But even so, it still would have been hard for us to root out 6,000 ISIS fighters out of Mosul. Bottom line is, in the future, when faced with a near-peer competitor or a lower-end hybrid threat, we will likely fight in large cities. And we need to be prepared for large-scale destruction and loss, and we will have to rapidly and continuously integrate all domains of warfare if we want to prevail with minimum destruction and loss of life. I spent some time talking about our evolving concept, multi-domain operations, as well as some of the challenges of future war. But you may not place much stock in the pronouncements of an American general. So I'm now going to call on one of your own, one of the greatest military thinkers of our time, for his views. Roll the tape. Multi-domain operations, that's what he's talking about. We just celebrated the 74th anniversary of Operation Overlord, D-Day. We must never forget that the foundation upon which everything depends is built on cohesive teams, bounded by mutual trust and a shared understanding of the job to be done. This is true whether we are speaking about infantry rifle squads or coalition partners. The operational environment will continue to change. Technology will continue to change. But one thing that won't change: battles are won or lost by young soldiers and young leaders fighting in the sand and in the mud and in the heat and in the cold. We owe them the very best training, equipment, leadership, and ideas that we can provide them. We live in dangerous times. The freedoms we enjoy are not guaranteed. They require continued vigilance. Evolving our armies for the challenges of the future will require a united effort. One thing I know for certain: the United States can always count on our most important ally, the United Kingdom, to work with us side by side to forge the bonds of victory. Thank you very much.
General, thanks for it. I cannot sum that up, but I thought that your message was delivered with humour, but the message behind it was a really, really sober one, about conflict at scale and the bounds of victory. And it's a very different message than perhaps you hear in other areas. It was really important to hear as well that the way you concluded it was the sentiment that this was about leaders living up to their people and delivering on that responsibility they had to their people, to their soldiers, marines, aviators, sailors. These are really important messages, but it was also a little bit to me about living up to the legacy of previous generations who set a remarkably high bar for which we all have to perform.